In a quiet little town surrounded by green hills and old factories, there lived a teenage boy named Ethan Parker. At just 16 years old, Ethan was an ordinary kid with extraordinary dreams. He wanted to become a professional MMA fighter, a dream that seemed almost impossible for someone like him. Shy and reserved, Ethan didn't stand out in a crowd. But what he lacked in confidence, he made up for in determination. Every evening after school, you could find him practicing punches and kicks in his backyard, imagining himself as a champion. Inside the cage, Ethan's biggest supporter and toughest critic was his grandfather, Jack. A retired military man, Jack had spent decades serving his country. What few people knew about Jack was that during his time in the armed forces, he had trained some of the most elite soldiers in the world, Navy SEALs. His methods were tough but fair, and his lessons went far beyond physical strength. Discipline, focus, and respect were the cornerstones of everything Jack taught. To Ethan, his grandpa wasn't just a hero, he was a living legend. Despite growing up hearing stories about Jack's incredible career, Ethan rarely mentioned his grandfather outside their home. It wasn't because he was ashamed, it was quite the opposite. Ethan felt it would be disrespectful to brag about something so personal and meaningful. Besides, he didn't want anyone thinking he was trying to ride on his grandpa's coattails. If Ethan was going to succeed, he wanted it to be on his own merit. One day, Ethan decided it was time to take his passion for fighting to the next level. He signed up at a local mixed martial arts gym called Iron Fist. The gym was run by Coach Marcus Kane, a former cage fighter who had earned a reputation for being one of the toughest trainers in the area. With bulging muscles, a booming voice, and a no-nonsense attitude, Marcus commanded respect from everyone who walked through the door. Some admired him for his dedication to the sport, while others whispered behind his back about his explosive temper and oversized ego. From the moment Ethan stepped into the gym, he knew this wouldn't be easy. The air smelled of sweat and leather, and the sound of fists hitting pads echoed off the walls. Men and women of all shapes and sizes trained tirelessly, pushing their bodies to the limit. For Ethan, it was both intimidating and exhilarating. This was exactly where he wanted to be. Coach Marcus wasted no time putting the new kid to work. On Ethan's very first day, he was thrown into a grueling workout routine designed to test his endurance and mental toughness. Push-ups, sit-ups, sprints, and heavy bag drills left Ethan gasping for breath, but he refused to give up. When Marcus barked orders or criticized his form, Ethan bit his tongue and kept going. He was determined to prove that he belonged here, even if it meant swallowing his pride. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became a regular at the gym. He arrived early every morning and stayed late into the evening, soaking up every piece of advice Marcus threw his way. Despite the coach's harsh demeanor, Ethan saw glimpses of wisdom beneath the bluster. Marcus knew the sport inside and out, and when he wasn't yelling, he actually offered valuable tips that helped Ethan improve. But as much as Ethan tried to stay focused, he couldn't ignore the tension brewing between him and Marcus. The coach seemed to have a knack for finding fault in everything Ethan did. Whether it was the angle of his punch, the speed of his kick, or the way he carried himself, Marcus always found something to criticize. At first, Ethan told himself, it was part of the process. All great fighters had to endure tough love to reach their potential. But as the days turned into weeks, the constant negativity began to wear on him. What made matters worse was the way Marcus treated other students. While some responded well to his abrasive style, others crumbled under the pressure. There were moments when Ethan wondered if Marcus truly cared about helping his students grow, or if he simply enjoyed exerting power over them. Still, Ethan held his ground. He reminded himself why he was there, to chase his dream, not to let someone else's behavior derail him. Unbeknownst to Ethan, however, fate had something unexpected in store. Little did he know that a single comment, meant to defend himself, would set off a chain of events that would change everything. And standing quietly in the shadows, watching and waiting, was his grandfather, Jack. Though Jack rarely spoke about his past, he had secrets of his own. Secrets that would soon come to light in ways no one could have predicted. As Ethan continued to train, oblivious to what lay ahead, He remained steadfast in his belief that hard work and perseverance would eventually pay off. What he didn't realize was that sometimes life throws challenges your way that require more than just grit. They demand courage, humility, and the willingness to stand up for what's right. It was a typical afternoon at Iron Fist Gym, with the usual chaos of punches landing on pads, grunts of exertion filling the air, and the rhythmic thud of feet shuffling across the mat. Ethan had been training for weeks now, slowly building his skills under Coach Marcus's watchful and often critical eye. Today, however, felt different. The atmosphere in the gym seemed heavier than usual, charged with an unspoken tension that made everyone move a little faster, hit a little harder. Ethan stood in the center of the sparring ring, facing off against one of the more experienced fighters at the gym, a burly guy named Ryan who had already competed in several amateur bouts. Ryan wasn't just bigger and stronger. He was also quicker on his feet, and Ethan struggled to keep up. Every time Ethan tried to throw a punch or kick, Ryan countered effortlessly, leaving him stumbling backward. Sweat poured down Ethan's face as he pushed himself to stay in the fight, but it was clear he was outmatched. From the sidelines, Coach Marcus watched with arms crossed, his expression growing darker by the second. "Come on, Ethan," Marcus barked, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "Is that all you've got? You're moving like a turtle out there. Pick up the pace." Ethan flinched at the sharpness in Marcus's tone but nodded quickly, trying to focus. He knew Marcus was tough on everyone. It was part of his reputation. But today, the criticism felt especially biting. Each word landed like a punch, chipping away at Ethan's confidence. Still, he refused to give up. He dug deep, summoning every ounce of energy he had left, and lunged forward with a right hook aimed at Ryan's jaw. Ryan saw it coming from a mile away. With a swift sidestep, he dodged the punch and delivered a light tap to Ethan's ribs, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough to remind him who was in control. Ethan stumbled again, nearly losing his balance, and frustration bubbled inside him. He hated feeling weak, hated letting Marcus see him struggle. But most of all, he hated the way Marcus's words made him doubt himself. "Pathetic," Marcus shouted, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "What are you even doing here, kid? If you can't handle this, maybe you should stick to playing video games or whatever it is you do in your free time." The comment stung worse than any punch Ryan could have thrown. Ethan clenched his fists, his face burning with shame. He wanted to yell back, to tell Marcus that he didn't know anything about him, that he worked harder than anyone else in the gym. But before he could stop himself, something slipped out of his mouth, barely above a whisper. "My grandpa could take you down," Ethan muttered under his breath, his voice trembling with anger and embarrassment. He trained Navy SEALs. For a split second, silence fell over the gym. Everyone stopped what they were doing, turning their heads toward Ethan. Even Ryan paused mid-punch, his eyes widening in surprise. No one dared speak, waiting to see how Marcus would react. Marcus froze, his jaw tightening as he processed Ethan's words. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped closer to the ring, his boots thudding against the floor with each heavy step. His eyes locked onto Ethan's, cold and unforgiving. "What did you just say?" Marcus growled, his voice dangerously low. Ethan swallowed hard, realizing too late that he'd crossed a line. He hadn't meant to provoke Marcus. It had just slipped out in the heat of the moment. But now, with every pair of eyes in the gym fixed on him, there was no taking it back. I just meant," Ethan stammered, his voice shaking. "My grandpa. He's really good. He knows a lot about fighting." Marcus let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Oh, so your grandpa thinks he's better than me, huh? Is that what you're saying?" He climbed into the ring, towering over Ethan like a storm cloud ready to burst. "You think bringing up your family excuses your weakness?" Before Ethan could respond, Marcus grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, yanking him forward until their faces were inches apart. "Listen here, kid," Marcus snarled, his breath hot against Ethan's skin. "This isn't about your grandpa or your little sob stories. This is about you proving yourself. And if you can't handle a little pressure, then maybe you don't. Belong here. Without warning, Marcus raised his hand and delivered a sharp slap across Ethan's cheek. The sound echoed through the gym, sharp and startling. Ethan staggered back, his hand flying to his face as tears welled up in his eyes. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The other students exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. No one moved. Marcus released, Ethan stepping back with a look of smug satisfaction. Now get back to work, he snapped, turning away as if nothing had happened. And don't ever bring up your family again. Ethan stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The sting on his cheek was nothing compared to the humiliation burning inside him. He wanted to run, to disappear, but instead he forced himself to nod and return to his stance. Ryan hesitated for a moment, then resumed sparring, though his movements were noticeably gentler now. Ethan went through the motions mechanically, his mind racing with thoughts of how badly he'd messed up. After practice ended, Ethan hurried out of the gym without saying a word to anyone. He couldn't bear to face the pitying looks or awkward silences. As he walked home, his cheek still throbbing, he replayed the scene over and over in his head. Why had he said anything about his grandpa? Why hadn't he kept his mouth shut? Worst of all, why hadn't anyone stood up for him? When Ethan finally reached his house, he found his grandfather sitting on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee. Jack looked up as Ethan approached, immediately noticing the red mark on his grandson's face. "And what happened to you?" Jack asked, his brow furrowing with concern. Ethan hesitated, debating whether to lie or tell the truth. In the end, he couldn't hold it in any longer. Tears spilled down his cheeks as he recounted the entire story, from the sparring match to Marcus's cruel words and the humiliating slap. By the time he finished, he was sobbing uncontrollably, overwhelmed by a mix of anger, shame, and helplessness. Jack listened silently, his expression unreadable. When Ethan finally quieted down, Jack sighed deeply, setting his coffee mug aside. "Son," he said gently, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder, "there are things I've kept hidden from you because they weren't meant to define me, or you. But if this coach thinks slapping someone makes him tough, then maybe it's time he learned a lesson." Ethan looked up, confused. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" Jack smiled faintly, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "Let's just say, not everyone knows the full story of who I am. And sometimes people need a reminder of what real strength looks like." Though Ethan didn't fully understand what his grandfather meant, he felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. Maybe, just maybe, things weren't as hopeless as they seemed. Ethan wiped the last of his tears away, still feeling a mix of confusion and hope as he looked at his grandfather. Jack's calm demeanor was reassuring, but Ethan couldn't shake the nagging question in his mind. What could his grandpa possibly do to stand up to someone like Coach Marcus? Sure, Jack had trained Navy SEALs, but that was decades ago. How would that even matter now, especially against someone who lived and breathed modern MMA? Sensing his grandson's doubts, Jack leaned back in his chair, letting out a soft chuckle. "You think I'm just some old man with stories from the past, don't you?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Jack held up a hand to stop him. "It's okay, son, I get it. But let me tell you something. There's more to my story than you know." Jack paused for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, then began, speaking in a tone that was both reflective and resolute. "Back in my day, training soldiers wasn't just about teaching them how to fight. It was about shaping their character, making sure they understood the difference between brute force and real strength. And believe it or not, some of those lessons caught the attention of people outside the military." Ethan frowned, tilting, his head slightly. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" Jack smiled faintly, his eyes distant as if recalling memories long buried. "I wasn't just training SEALs, Ethan. I also worked with fighters, professional ones. Back in the early days of MMA, when it was still finding its footing, I helped refine techniques for some of the best in the business. One of those fighters..." He trailed off, glancing at Ethan with a knowing look. Ethan's eyes widened. "Who, Grandpa? Who did you work with?" Jack hesitated for a moment, then said the name that would change everything. "Chuck Little." Ethan's jaw dropped. "Chuck Little, The legendary UFC Hall of Famer known as the Iceman? The same Chuck Liddell whose knockout power had become the stuff of legends? Ethan had seen videos of Chuck's fights online, watched interviews, where he spoke about his journey to greatness. To think that his own grandfather had played a role in shaping one of the greatest fighters in history was almost too much to process. Wait. You knew Chuck Liddell? Ethan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Like personally? Jack nodded, a hint of pride creeping into his weathered features. We were friends, yes. He came to me years ago when he was fine-tuning his striking technique. People always talked about his power, but what set Chuck apart was his precision, his ability to read an opponent and strike at just the right moment. I helped him sharpen those skills, and in return, he taught me a thing or two about adapting to new styles of fighting. Jack chuckled softly. He used to call me the professor, because I was always breaking things down step by step. Ethan sat there stunned. His quiet, unassuming grandfather, a man who spent most of his days tending to his garden or tinkering with old tools in the garage, had once been a mentor to one of the biggest names in combat sports. It was hard to wrap his head around, but at the same time, it made perfect sense. Everything Jack had ever taught him, the importance of discipline, focus, and respect, it all lined up perfectly with what Ethan admired about fighters like Chuck Liddell. But amidst the awe, a new thought began to form in Ethan's mind. Grandpa, he said slowly, does Chuck still... do you guys still talk? Jack's smile widened, and he gave a small nod. Every now and then. We've kept in touch over the years. Why do you ask? Ethan hesitated, unsure how to phrase what he was thinking. Well, if Marcus thinks slapping someone makes him tough, maybe he needs to see what real toughness looks like. Maybe we should show him. For a moment, Jack didn't respond. Instead, he studied Ethan carefully, as if weighing the idea. Finally, he let out a deep sigh and stood up, brushing imaginary dust off his jeans. All right, son, he said firmly. If this coach needs a lesson in humility, then I suppose it's time I paid him a visit. And if Chuck happens to be free... He trailed off, a mischievous glint in his eye. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a strange sense of anticipation. He wasn't sure what his grandfather had planned, but the thought of seeing Marcus face-to-face with Jack and possibly Chuck Liddell was enough to make his heart race. After breakfast, Jack called Ethan into the living room, where he was already on the phone. From the snippets of conversation Ethan overheard, it sounded like Jack was catching up with an old friend. Yeah, it's been too long, Jack said, his voice warm and familiar. Listen, I need a favor. There's a situation here that might require your expertise. He chuckled at whatever response he received, then added, Don't worry, nothing serious. Just a little reminder about respect. When Jack hung up, he turned to Ethan with a satisfied grin. Chuck's on board, he announced. He'll meet us at the gym tomorrow afternoon. Now here's what we're going to do. As Jack laid out the plan, Ethan felt a surge of excitement mixed with nervousness. This was really happening. They were actually going to confront Marcus, not with anger or aggression, but with a demonstration of true strength. For the first time since the incident, Ethan felt a spark of confidence reignite within him. His grandpa wasn't just stepping in to defend him. He was showing him that standing up for yourself didn't have to mean stooping to someone else's level. That night, as Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but imagine how Marcus would react when he realized who he was dealing with. Would he try to act tough, or would he crumble under the weight of Jack's reputation and Chuck's presence? Either way, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow was going to be a day none of them would forget anytime soon. By weaving in details about Jack's past and introducing the possibility of Chuck Liddell's involvement, this section builds suspense while deepening the audience's connection to the characters. It also sets the stage for the dramatic confrontation in Part 4, keeping readers engaged and eager to see what happens next. The next afternoon, the air at Iron Fist Gym was thick with its usual energy. Fighters grunted as they hit heavy bags, trainers shouted instructions, and the rhythmic thud of gloves meeting pads echoed through the space. Ethan walked in cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of what was about to happen. Would Marcus be angry? Embarrassed? Or would he try to brush it off like nothing was wrong? As Ethan entered, he noticed something unusual. The gym was quieter than normal, almost as if everyone sensed that something big was about to go down. A few students glanced toward the front of the room, whispering among themselves. Ethan followed their gaze and froze. Standing near the entrance, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, was his grandfather, Jack. But that wasn't all. Beside him stood none other than Chuck Liddell, the legendary UFC Hall of Famer himself. Chuck looked exactly like he did in the videos Ethan had watched countless times, tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an aura of quiet confidence. His signature flat-brimmed hat sat firmly on his head, and his sunglasses were perched on his nose despite being indoors. Even without saying a word, his presence commanded attention. The moment Ethan saw him, his nerves melted away, replaced by a surge of pride and excitement. This wasn't just any day at the gym. This was history unfolding right before his eyes. Coach Marcus, who had been barking orders at a group of fighters, finally noticed the commotion. His brow furrowed as he approached the two men standing near the door. "What's going on here?" Marcus demanded, his voice sharp and impatient. He glanced at Jack first, then at Chuck, clearly confused but trying to mask it with bravado. "Who are these guys?" Jack stepped forward, his posture relaxed but authoritative. "I'm Jack Parker," he said calmly, extending a hand. "Ethan's grandfather." When Marcus reluctantly shook his hand, Jack gestured toward Chuck. "And this is my friend, Chuck Liddell." For a split second, Marcus's expression faltered. Recognition dawned on his face as he realized who he was dealing with. "Chuck Liddell?" he repeated, his tone softer now, tinged with disbelief. "The Chuck Liddell?" "The one and only," Chuck replied, removing his sunglasses to reveal piercing blue eyes. His voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of someone who didn't need to raise it to be heard. "Nice to meet you, Coach." Marcus stammered for a moment, clearly caught off guard. Yeah, nice to meet you too." He glanced around the room, where every single person had stopped what they were doing to watch the exchange. It was obvious that Marcus didn't know how to handle the situation. On one hand, he wanted to maintain his tough guy image. On the other, he couldn't ignore the fact that he was standing face to face with a living legend. Jack wasted no time getting to the point. "We're here because of what happened yesterday," he said, his voice firm but measured. "You disrespected my grandson, and I won't stand for that. Not from anyone." Marcus stiffened, his defenses rising immediately. "Look, I run a tight ship here," he began, his tone defensive. "If Ethan can't handle criticism, maybe this isn't the place for him." "That's not what this is about," Jack interrupted, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Criticism is one thing. Humiliating a kid and slapping him across the face is another. That kind of behavior has no place in a gym, or anywhere else for that matter." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Everyone waited to see how Marcus would respond. For a moment he seemed ready to argue, but then his shoulders sagged slightly as if realizing he was outnumbered, not just by Jack and Chuck, but by the collective judgment of everyone watching. "I didn't mean to," Marcus started, his voice trailing off. He ran a hand over his shaved head, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I was frustrated, okay? I push my students hard because I want them to succeed. Sometimes I cross the line, but I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "It's not about what you meant," Chuck interjected, his tone surprisingly gentle despite the authority behind it. "It's about what you did. You can't treat people like that, especially kids. Real strength isn't about dominating others. It's about lifting them up, helping them grow. If you're so focused on breaking people down that you forget why you started coaching in the first place, then you've lost sight of what matters." Marcus opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded slowly, his expression softening. For the first time since Ethan had met him, Marcus looked vulnerable. Human, even. It was clear that Chuck's words had struck a nerve. Jack took a step closer, his tone shifting from confrontational to instructive. "Let me show you something," he said, motioning for Marcus to follow him to the center of the mat. Reluctantly, Marcus complied, his curiosity outweighing his pride. Jack turned to address the rest of the gym. "Everyone gather around. This might be useful for all of you." As the students formed a circle, Jack began demonstrating basic techniques, stances, footwork, and striking mechanics. His movements were precise and deliberate, a testament to years of experience. Occasionally, he called on Chuck to demonstrate a move or offer insight, which sent murmurs of admiration rippling through the crowd. What started as a tense standoff quickly transformed into an impromptu masterclass, with Jack and Chuck sharing wisdom that left everyone in awe. At one point, Jack paused and looked directly at Marcus. "This is how you build respect," he said, gesturing to the attentive students surrounding them. "Not by tearing people down, but by showing them what's possible when they work together. Discipline, focus, and mutual respect, that's what makes a champion, not fear." Marcus listened intently, nodding along as if finally understanding the lesson being imparted. By the end of the session, the atmosphere in the gym had shifted entirely. Gone was the hostility and tension that had dominated the room earlier. In its place was a sense of unity and purpose, fueled by the shared experience of learning from two legends. When the demonstration concluded, Marcus approached Jack and Chuck, his demeanor noticeably humbler. "Thank you," he said sincerely, extending a hand to each of them. "I needed to hear that, and I promise I'll do better." Jack accepted the handshake with a small smile, while Chuck simply nodded, his sunglasses back in place. "Good," Jack said, "because Ethan's got potential, and I expect you to help him reach it." With that, the trio turned to leave, leaving behind a gym full of inspired fighters, and a coach who had just learned one of the most important lessons of his life. The days that followed Jack and Chuck's visit to Iron Fist Gym were unlike anything Ethan or anyone else had ever experienced. The transformation in the gym was palpable, almost as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the room. Coach Marcus, once known for his explosive temper and harsh criticism, now carried himself with a newfound humility. He wasn't soft by any means. He still pushed his students hard. But there was a noticeable shift in his approach. Instead of yelling insults or belittling mistakes, he offered constructive feedback, encouraging fighters to learn from their errors rather than fear them. For Ethan, this change made all the difference. The sting of Marcus's slap and the humiliation of being publicly reprimanded began to fade, as he noticed how much more supportive the coach had become. During sparring sessions, Marcus would pull Ethan aside after each round, pointing out areas for improvement but always ending with a word of encouragement. "Keep your guard up," he'd say, or "nice footwork. Now let's work on your timing." These small adjustments, paired with Marcus's new tone, gave Ethan the confidence to push harder than ever before. But it wasn't just Marcus who changed. The entire gym seemed to come alive with renewed energy. Word spread quickly about Jack and Chuck's impromptu masterclass, and soon, stories of the legendary UFC Hall of Famer mingling with local fighters became the stuff of gym lore. Students who had previously kept to themselves started working together, sharing tips and cheering each other on during drills. Even Ryan, the burly fighter who had dominated Ethan in their earlier sparring match, took the younger teen under his wing, offering advice and practicing techniques with him after hours. Jack and Chuck's influence extended beyond the gym walls, too. Inspired by their lesson on discipline and respect, Marcus implemented weekly team-building exercises designed to foster camaraderie among the fighters. One Friday evening, he organized a group run through the hilly trails near the town, challenging everyone to finish without leaving anyone behind. Another time, he hosted a potluck dinner at the gym, where students brought food and shared stories about why they loved MMA. It was during these moments that Ethan realized something profound. Strength wasn't just about physical power. It was about connection. The bonds forming between the fighters were making them stronger, not just as individuals, but as a team. Ethan's relationship with his grandfather deepened as well. Before the incident with Marcus, Ethan had always admired Jack but never fully understood the depth of his accomplishments. Now, seeing firsthand how respected Jack was, even by someone like Chuck Liddell, gave Ethan a deeper appreciation for the lessons his grandpa had been teaching him all along. Every evening after practice, Ethan would sit with Jack on the porch, recounting the day's events and asking questions about his military and training experiences. Jack, in turn, listened patiently, occasionally sharing anecdotes that left Ethan wide-eyed with wonder. One story in particular stuck with Ethan. Jack told him about a young SEAL recruit named Tom who struggled with self-doubt early in his training. Tom was fast and strong, but he didn't believe in himself, Jack explained. Every time things got tough, he wanted to quit. So I sat him down one day and said, "Tom, you're not fighting for yourself. You're fighting for the guy next to you. When you remember that, everything else falls into place." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, realizing how similar Tom's struggles were to his own. For so long, he'd been focused on proving himself, to Marcus, to his peers, even to himself, that he'd forgotten the bigger picture. Fighting wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about growth, perseverance, and standing up for what mattered most. As weeks turned into months, Ethan's progress became impossible to ignore. His punches grew sharper, his kicks faster, and his stamina seemingly endless. More importantly, his mindset shifted. Where once he had doubted his abilities, he now embraced challenges with determination. He still stumbled occasionally, sparring matches didn't always go his way, and some workouts left him exhausted and frustrated. But he no longer saw setbacks as failures. They were opportunities to improve, lessons disguised as obstacles. Marcus noticed the change in Ethan and couldn't help but feel proud. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling session, he pulled Ethan aside. "You've come a long way, kid," Marcus said, his voice tinged with genuine admiration. "I know I didn't make it easy for you in the beginning, and I'm sorry for that. But look at you now, you're tougher than half the fighters here." Ethan smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "Thanks, coach, I couldn't have done it without you or my grandpa." Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't thank me yet. You've still got a long road ahead of you. But if you keep this up, I think you'll surprise a lot of people, including yourself." The turning point came when Marcus announced that the gym would host its first ever amateur fight night. Fighters from neighboring towns would compete against Iron Fist's best, and Ethan's name was on the roster. At first, Ethan panicked. He wasn't ready, not for something this big, but Marcus reassured him, reminding him of everything he'd learned over the past few months. "This isn't about winning or losing," Marcus said. "It's about showing everyone, including yourself, what you're capable of." On the night of the event, the gym buzzed with excitement. Friends, family, and fans packed the bleachers, cheering loudly as each bout unfolded. When Ethan's turn finally came, he stepped into the ring with a mix of nerves and resolve. Across from him stood a seasoned opponent named Derek, known for his aggressive style and knockout power. As the referee signaled the start of the match, Ethan took a deep breath, remembering Jack's words, "Stay calm. Trust your training." The fight was intense, with both fighters exchanging blows and testing each other's defenses. Derek landed several powerful strikes, forcing Ethan to dig deep and rely on every technique he'd practiced. Though battered and bruised, Ethan refused to back down. In the final round, fueled by adrenaline and sheer willpower, he managed to land a clean punch that sent Derek stumbling backward. The crowd erupted in cheers as the referee raised Ethan's hand in victory. Afterward, as Ethan hugged his grandpa and thanked Marcus, he realized something important. Winning the fight wasn't what mattered most. It was the journey that had brought him here. Through every challenge, every setback, and every triumph, he had grown stronger, not just as a fighter, but as a person. And standing beside him were the people who had helped shape him, his grandfather, his coach, and even Chuck Liddell, whose brief appearance had sparked a chain reaction of positive change. As the celebration continued late into the night, Ethan glanced around the gym, taking in the laughter, the camaraderie, and the sense of belonging. For the first time, he truly understood what Jack had meant when he said real champions weren't defined by their victories. They were defined by how they treated others. And in that moment, surrounded by friends and mentors, Ethan felt like a champion in every sense of the word. The weeks following Ethan's amateur fight night were a whirlwind of emotions. While he hadn't won every bout, he lost a few matches in subsequent events. The experience taught him lessons far more valuable than any trophy or title ever could. Each victory filled him with pride, but each defeat became a stepping stone, pushing him to reflect, adapt, and grow. What mattered most was that Ethan no longer feared failure. Instead, he embraced it as part of the journey, understanding that setbacks were opportunities to learn. Jack watched his grandson's transformation with quiet satisfaction. The shy, uncertain boy who once hesitated to speak up had grown into a confident young man who carried himself with purpose. It wasn't just about fighting anymore. Ethan had discovered something deeper within himself, a resilience that extended beyond the gym. Whether it was helping a struggling classmate at school, standing up for someone being bullied, or simply offering words of encouragement to a fellow fighter after a tough loss, Ethan embodied the values Jack had instilled in him: discipline, respect, and humility. Marcus, too, continued to evolve as a coach. His reputation began to shift from that of a hard-nosed tyrant to a mentor who genuinely cared about his students' growth, both inside and outside the cage. Fighters from neighboring towns started flocking to Iron Fist Gym, drawn not only by its rigorous training programs but also by the culture of mutual support and camaraderie Marcus had cultivated. Even Ryan, the burly fighter who had once dominated Ethan in sparring sessions, credited Marcus's new approach for helping him secure his first professional win. One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch with Jack, the two of them sipping lemonade and watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jack spoke softly. "You know, son," he began, his voice tinged with nostalgia, "I never thought my past would matter much to anyone anymore. But seeing how it's helped you and Marcus and all those kids at the gym, it makes me realize something." "What's that, Grandpa?" Ethan asked, turning to look at him. Jack smiled faintly, his weathered face illuminated by the golden glow of twilight. "Legacies aren't built on fame or titles, they're built on the impact we have on others. Those SEALs I trained, Chuck Liddell, even you, they're all part of my legacy, and now you're building your own. Every time you step into that ring, every time you help someone else improve, you're leaving a mark. That's what truly matters." Ethan nodded slowly, letting his grandfather's words sink in. He thought about the people who had shaped him: Jack, whose wisdom and strength had been a guiding light; Marcus, who had transformed from a harsh critic into a supportive mentor; and Chuck Liddell, whose brief appearance had ignited a spark of change in the gym. Each of them had played a role in helping Ethan become the person he was today. A few days later, Ethan received an unexpected visitor at home. It was Marcus, carrying a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. "Hey, kid," Marcus said, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. "Got something for you." Curious, Ethan took the box and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a pair of worn leather gloves, their surface cracked and faded with age. Etched onto the wristband in faded ink were the initials CL. Ethan's eyes widened as realization dawned. These were Chuck Liddell's gloves, the same ones he'd worn during his legendary career. "Chuck sent them over," Marcus explained, a hint of pride in his voice. "Said they belonged to someone who needed reminding that real champions are made through heart and grit, not just skill. Thought you might appreciate 'em." Ethan ran his fingers over the gloves, feeling the weight of their history. They weren't just a gift. They were a symbol of everything he'd learned over the past year. Heart and grit, that's what defined a true fighter. Not brute force, not flashy techniques, but the determination to keep going no matter the odds. That weekend, Ethan brought the gloves to the gym, where they became a source of inspiration for everyone. Fighters passing by would pause to admire them, imagining the battles they'd seen and the hands that had worn them. Marcus hung them on the wall near the entrance, alongside a plaque that read, "Real champions are defined by how they treat others." Months turned into years. Ethan's journey in MMA took him to new heights. He competed in regional tournaments, earned recognition for his technical prowess and sportsmanship, and eventually secured a spot in a prestigious national competition. Though he didn't always win, His reputation as a respectful and determined fighter preceded him wherever he went. Coaches and opponents alike praised his character, noting that he represented the best of what the sport stood for. But Ethan never forgot where he came from. Whenever he returned home, he visited Jack, sharing stories of his adventures and listening intently as his grandfather offered advice. On one such visit, Jack handed Ethan a framed photograph. It was a picture taken shortly after Chuck's visit to the gym, showing Jack, Ethan, Marcus, and Chuck standing together, smiling proudly. Beneath the photo, Jack had written a simple caption: "Strength through unity." "You take this with you," Jack said, placing the frame in Ethan's hands. "Whenever things get tough, remember where you started, and the people who believed in you when you doubted yourself." Years later, when Ethan finally retired from competitive fighting, he did so not with regret, but with gratitude. He had achieved more than he ever dreamed possible, but his greatest accomplishment wasn't the medals or accolades. It was the lives he'd touched along the way. Many of his former teammates went on to become coaches themselves, spreading the lessons they'd learned at Iron Fist Gym. Others pursued careers outside of MMA, carrying with them the values of discipline, respect, and perseverance. Even Marcus remained a constant presence in Ethan's life, attending his fights and cheering him on from the sidelines. Their bond had grown stronger over the years, evolving from teacher and student to close friends. When Ethan opened his own gym, a state-of-the-art facility named Legacy Martial Arts, he invited Marcus to be his head trainer. Together, they created a space where fighters of all ages and skill levels could train, grow, and thrive. On the opening day of Legacy Martial Arts, Ethan stood in front of a crowd of supporters, including Jack, Marcus, and several former teammates. Hanging prominently on the wall behind him were Chuck Little's gloves, a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. As Ethan addressed the audience, his voice filled with emotion. "This gym isn't just about fighting," he said, glancing at the gloves and then at Jack, who sat beaming in the front row. "It's about building something bigger than ourselves. It's about lifting each other up, learning from our mistakes, and striving to be better, not just as athletes but as human beings. My grandpa once told me that legacies are built on the impact we have on others, so let's make sure ours is one worth remembering." The crowd erupted in applause, and Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment wash over him. He had come a long way since that fateful day when Marcus slapped him in the gym, a moment that had seemed like the end of the world at the time. But looking back, Ethan realized it had been the beginning of something extraordinary. Through challenges and triumphs, through pain and perseverance, Ethan had discovered the true meaning of strength. It wasn't about dominance or superiority. It was about connection, respect, and the courage to stand up for what was right. And as he looked around the room at the faces of those who had supported him every step of the way, he knew one thing for certain: his legacy was just beginning.